I had a great discussion earlier today. It's been a wonderful day so far, and this is very much still work in progress. So I'm not sure what the convention is, but if you are amenable, please do feel free to shout out questions throughout the talk. I won't be monitoring the Zoom chat, but please do interrupt if you have any suggestions or thoughts as the presentation goes on. And before I go any further, let me mention that the views of this that are expressed in this presentation are mine and not my employer's. Okay, so as background, today's paper will concern itself with the question of which firms tend to adopt new technologies. So as I write here, this is an important question for several fields within economics and within management and social sciences more generally. And while there are existing data sets which look at things like patenting activity, R&D expenditures, or other measures that try to measure or proxy for technology adoption, these measures are either not comprehensive, so R&D expenditures are measured only for publicly traded firms, or are not really comparable across industries and time. So the extent to which innovations are patented may be a function not only of innovation, but also of the function of the legal environment, the competitive landscape, and so on. So we're in this paper, we're going to propose a new measure of technology adoption based on the types of employees that firms seek. This is a measure that can be computed across all firms in a comparable way, comparably across industry, looking at both for publicly traded and privately held firms. All we need is the firm to be seeking out some employment for us to get a measure of their the extent to which they're adopting new technologies. And more generally, the main kind of idea behind this paper is that since many employer-employee relationships are long-lived, the vacancy postings that we'll look at not only lead to new matches between employers and employees, but also provide a window to us as researchers on firms' aspirations and capabilities over the next several years. Okay, so in this presentation, we'll address the following two questions. So first, how do hiring decisions reflect new technology adoption? So we'll try and propose a measure of technology adoption and see kind of what are the characteristics of that new measure. And second, once we have made this correspondence between firms' job advertising behavior and their innovativeness, we'll ask, what are the sources of new technology adoption? Is it through entry and exit of firms or existing firms who are updating the technologies that they use? Okay, let's talk about how we address this first question first. So to understand how hiring decisions reflect technology adoption, we'll utilize digitized text from these three newspapers, the New York Times, Boston Globe, and Wall Street Journal, from the last 6 decades of the 20th century. For each ad, we'll extract some pieces of information, including the job title that's mentioned in the ad. And for each job title, we'll measure jobs according to when in the sample that title appeared. So throughout the talk, I'll use the word vintage to describe these measures based off of when job titles appeared within our sample period. So these vintage measures will allow us to compare job titles. For example, comparing two accounting type jobs, the job title comptometer operator tended to appear earlier on than figure clerk. And our idea is that based off of this, jobs that are for comptometer operators likely represent an older vintage of technology that the firm is utilizing. So we'll show, to kind of validate that hypothesis, that firms with newer vintage job titles, they have higher R&D intensities, patent more, and furthermore, even conditioning on these existing measures of innovation, they tend to perform better in the future. In the second component of this presentation, which we'll cover in the last 5 or 10 minutes, we'll address the second research question. To what extent does the entry of new firms who bring with them relatively new vintage technologies, do they account for the overall aggregate change in technologies? So I'll describe to you a model that we develop and estimate in which both incumbents can update to newer vintage technologies and where firms enter and exit, and where new entry represents a second source of technology updating. Our model, estimated via a simulated method of moments procedure, will indicate that both entrants and incumbents are an important source of technology updating. Great. So our paper makes two main contributions. So first, in terms of measurement, relative to the literature on technology adoption, which are covered in these first 2 bullet points, or closer to the current paper that focuses on new work practices, which I think includes some work that you've seen relatively recently. We introduce new measures at the firm year level over a long time horizon across a wide swath of firms. Second, relative to the literature which studies firm technology upgrading and economic growth with the aid of equilibrium models, we're going to develop a model of technology adoption to answer a new substantive question, that is, to what extent do incumbents versus entrants account for the churning in the techniques that are used in the economy. Okay, are there any questions at this point?
Is there, well, no, I'm sure you're going to address them. Don't worry, go ahead.
Oh, okay, fantastic. Yeah, great. So the rest of the presentation will have 4 components. In the first, I'll describe our data set construction and how we define job title vintages. In the second, I'll try and argue briefly that these job title vintages are correlated with other work characteristics indicative of innovative activity, meaning that job titles, the change that goes on within our sample period has real economic content and is not just a relabeling of existing types of work. In the third part of the presentation, we'll show that firms' job title vintages, they're predictive of future performance. And then finally, with the aid of a model, we'll analyze the sources of job title vintage updating. Okay, so let's get to this first part in which we introduce the data set in our measures. So in this presentation, we'll draw on digitized job ad text from a few newspapers. Here is a sample of the type of information that we'll use. So on the left part of this slide, we have 2 columns from a page of ads from the New York Times in 1960. So we see in the left column of these 2 columns an ad for an accountant, one for a mechanical engineer, a third for methods engineer, and so on. For some of the ads, maybe it's a little small for you to see. We can see the name of the firm. So here's Johnson & Johnson. Here's Saucony Mobile Oil Company. All right. So this is on the left, we have the page of ads as they would have appeared if you were to open up the newspaper in 1960. On the right, we have the digitized version of this page of ads. So this is what we have procured from ProQuest, which is a firm that collects and digitizes newspaper text. So we see text corresponding. So here's that mechanical engineer job title, the accountant at the very top. We see as well, so somewhere here, there's the Saucony Mobile Oil Company firm name that was in the second column of the picture. Okay, so this is what we are starting out with. And our first task is going to be to determine which portions of text correspond to individual ads within this chunk of text. And then once we've done that, we'll extract as much as useful information as we can from this text. So part of this text processing has been done in past work. So this joint paper with Pai, who was a student of mine in Wisconsin, and then Sebastian and Danny, who are professors at Michigan and Nebraska. So in these papers, we've identified for each ad the job title, the educational requirements, the sets of tasks that workers are expected to perform in these jobs, and the technologies that they use. So just as a side note, the goal of this earlier paper was to measure the task and technology usage changes, how those changed within occupations over the second half of the 20th century, and to try to link these task and technology changes to increasing income inequality. Okay, so new to this particular paper, we'll try as best as we can to identify the firm name and the posted salary. And in addition, based off of the firm names, we'll from other data sources, will link to things like CompuStat or the NBER patenting database to get information about their balance sheet information, their patenting activity. And then we've also hand collected entry and exit dates for as many of the firms as we can in our sample. Now, before going any further, let me just mention there are some issues that about the representativeness of the sample that one might worry about that I think are important to flag. So first, newspaper ads, they may not be reflective of all of the types of jobs that people are being hired for. There are other ways to find jobs than by looking in the newspaper or looking online. So that's one thing. And second, Boston and New York, the metro areas from which our sample is constructed, they may not be representative of the entire nation. So in this paper, we've tried to assess as best as we can the importance of these types of concerns. I'm very happy to talk about them, but for the sake of time, I'll put these issues for the side today. Okay, so 2 slides ago, we saw the page of unprocessed text. So here gives the results from our text processing procedure. So we've separated out as best as we can the individual ads. We've identified the job title from each ad, which I've put in bold. We've assigned an occupation code. So this is the SOC code, if you're familiar with that, to each job title, and extracted information about things like experience, the name of the posting firm, educational requirements, and so forth. So even though it doesn't come up within this page, we do again look for mentions of salaries or technology mentions. And again, just to highlight some of the limitations of our approach, our text processing procedure isn't perfect. So we've missed the methods engineer being a separate ad from the mechanical engineer. But overall, we've done, I think, a pretty good job of faithfully extracting information from the job ad text. But just to be clear, there is going to be considerable measurement error that is in our data set. Okay, very good. So having described our algorithm to extract information from the text,
Can I
Let
ask?
me now just, oh, please, yes, great.
So
Oh.
did you try to do sort of like use mechanical Turk on a random sample to see if a human would agree or and check your algorithm?
That's a great suggestion. So we haven't done that. I think the one thing that we've done that was slightly along those lines is, well, first, when we were deciding, okay, how are we going to assign these occupation codes? We ended up, okay, maybe this is going off too much on a tangent. We relying on an unsupervised learning algorithm that would say, okay, what is the job title in ONET that is closest to transportation advertising supervisor, and based off of that, we assigned the SOC code. At the very beginning, we thought, oh, maybe we can apply, use some of our own intuition about what occupation codes correspond to each job title. And the problem that we ran into was that even among the 4 researchers within our team, we couldn't really come to an agreement. So in just one instance of this processing, we feel that some of the decisions are really like even difficult for humans to unambiguously describe or decide on. So that's one thing. And then a second exercise that we did, not relying on mechanical Turk like a large number of individuals, but we did have a different RA or an RA look through a few pages of ads after the fact to see to what extent did we properly find the boundaries between each individual ad and find the identity of the job title and find the firm. And I should, but I can't remember the results from that exercise. But so we haven't gone the full mechanical Turk route, but I think that could definitely be useful.
There are 2 ways you could use it, right? One way would just be, to convince your reader that your algorithm sort of makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
The other one is to develop a ground truth, and so you do supervised learning. So you create the ground truth with humans, and then you let the machine learning generalize it to the rest of the sample.
Right, and I think that would be right, especially useful for things like finding the job title, picking out the boundaries between ads, and then maybe also picking out the name of the firm. So I do agree. So for this second use of mechanical Turk, that there are definitely improvements that we could potentially make, and I think that's great. But we haven't done that so far. Are there follow-up questions or other questions? Okay, very good. So okay, having described the algorithm to extract information from the text, the next kind of piece of the puzzle is to describe how we define our measures of job title vintages. And so briefly, the idea will be to look at the distribution of years in which each job title in our data set appeared. And perhaps the easiest way to explain this will be by way of a sample with just 2 job titles. So here, what I'm plotting is for 2 job titles that appear in our data set. So figure clerk and comptometer operator. So again, these are kind of like accounting type jobs. And if you're curious, so comptometer is a kind of a type of calculator, which is now obsolete. And so we have are the years in our sample period, so going from 1940 to 2000. And on the vertical axis, we have the share within each year of the set of ads that correspond to each of these 2 job titles. So for example, in this year, which I think looks like 1946, maybe 0.2, 0.3% of the ads in our sample corresponded to comptometer operator, and essentially none of the ads corresponded to figure clerk. So we have in each year, in these points, either the plus signs or the X's, the raw counts, and then there's also kind of a smoothed version of this. So there is quite a bit of year-to-year variability that may reflect things just like perhaps measurement error or things like that. Okay, so the figure clerk jobs within our sample, they're basically non-existent in the first decades of our sample, then increased in prevalence up until 1970 or so, and then decreased to the point where by 1990, there were few advertisements for this particular job title. And the fact that there are no points here means that in these years, there were 0 ads that were corresponding to this job title. And we see something similar for the comptometer operator, but with an earlier peak where the frequency of ads corresponding to comptometer operator was earlier on in the sample. Okay, so finally, for the comptometer operator job title in green, or for the figure clerk job title in blue, we have these vertical lines that correspond to the first percentile year in which the job title appeared, the median year in which the job title year appeared, or the 99th percentile of the years in which the job title appeared. And so we think of these as the years in which the figure clerk job title first appeared in our sample, more or less, when it disappeared from the job market, or kind of some measure of the central tendency of the years in which the job title appeared. Okay, so we're going to, for these two job titles, describe the vintage of the job based off of the first percentile, 50th percentile, or 99th percentile of the years in which that job title appeared. More generally, these 3 numbers will characterize, they'll provide 3 measures of the vintage of any of the job titles within our data set. Okay, so it's on this basis that we'll say that figure clerk represents a newer vintage job title, and really maybe newer vintage work relative to jobs that advertise for comptometer operator jobs. Okay, so before getting into the main analysis, let me give you some descriptive statistics about our data set. So we've processed 5.2 million job ads from which we can identify the job title and for which the job title appears sufficiently frequently so that these first 50th and 99th percentile statistics make sense. So we drop ads for which the job title appears only 1 or a few times. So that leaves us with 5.2 million ads. There are 9,000 unique job titles within our data set. Within this broader sample of 5.2 million ads, there are slightly less than 200,000 ads for which we can identify the posted salary, and 250,000 ads for which we can identify the posting firm. So the reason that this number is so low, so we're working on further processing the text to extract information for a wider set of ads. But part of the reason, in addition to measurement error, that not all ads have a firm associated with it, is that many of the ads, especially early on in the sample, would just list a phone number or an address to which the applicant could submit an application, or that corresponded to a placement company or an employment agency that would intermediate between the applicant and the hiring firm. Okay, so how much dispersion is there in job title vintage in these measures of when a particular job title appeared. So when looking among the ads within a given year, we can ask how much dispersion is there in our job title vintage measures. And so the standard deviation, whether we're looking at measures based off of when the job title first appeared in our data set or when it last appeared, is roughly 6 or 7 years. Okay, so just to give you some intuition, here are a list of, oh, please.
I didn't get how you calculate the standard deviation. Do you have,
sorry, yes.
Of how long is the distance between the first percentile and the median, and between the median and the last one, and if it's truncated, not truncated, or do you have other descriptors besides the standard deviation?
So first, let me tell you how we computed this. I think I was unclear. So within each of the ads within our so we have a data set where an observation is an ad that was posted on a given year. We imagine running a regression in which you have as the dependent variable this first percentile measure, the year of emergence of the job title for that ad, and regress that on year fixed effects and take the residual from that regression. So we're saying, okay, among ads that are posted in a given year, how much dispersion is there in this one measure? And that's roughly 7 years. And same for this alternate measure, 6 years. And it is true that there is going to be quite a lot of truncation, especially to the left for this year of emergence variable. So it's impossible kind of mechanically for the year of emergence to be earlier than the beginning of our sample, 1940. So there is truncation there, and also truncation with this year of disappearance measure. So it's impossible to have this measure be any greater than 2000. Unfortunately, I don't have any other exercises that I can tell you about that would, but I'd welcome any ideas.
I mean, it would be interesting to know, would be interesting to know, the average duration of an occupation, the frequency with which new titles appear, the frequency over time of new titles appearing that might indicate some, dynamism in terms of new title appearances. And so I don't know, there would be many interesting moments of this distribution that I would really be interested in knowing more about.
The duration of an ad, the duration of a job title, when the frequency with which at different points in time job titles first appeared or disappeared. I think these are all things that are great and that we can definitely look at. Was there someone else?
Yes, I have a question. I cannot raise my hand because I'm host, so I'll need to shout it out.
That's great. Please, yes.
I thought it's a good point if at which you can tell us more about how to think about the nature of selection. Given how the final set of ads was selected, are we looking at job ads from larger firms? Are we looking at job ads for certain kinds of occupations that are not well suited for intermediaries like the employment agencies? Can you tell us more about what you know or what you expect to be included and not included?
That's great. So many of these things are things we haven't explored sufficiently. So so one statistic I didn't mention is that roughly 80,000 of the 250,000 ads correspond to firms that are publicly traded. And my recollection is that over this sample period, this roughly corresponds to the fraction of employment that is in publicly traded firms. So That's one statistic. But then to the broader question of, are we under or overrepresenting big firms or small firms? That's something that we can definitely explore more. To the question of occupational mix, so something that we looked at in the past paper and that we're really not controlling for now, but maybe there's ways to control for it, is that jobs that appear, or newspaper job ads tend to focus relative to overall employment more on white collar occupations, and especially office like administrative assistants, managerial work, those types of occupations relative to things like manufacturing, production, construction. They're just in the newspapers in our sample, there are very few ads corresponding to that type of work. So something that would be first pass, it would be an improvement that we haven't implemented yet, would be perhaps to grade your way to those types of occupations that are less frequently found in newspapers. And then to your question of to what extent, okay, so that's one form of representativeness of what types of work are found more in newspapers versus other sources. And then there's what you specifically asked, which I think is also something that we can explore more, is what types of ads, what types of jobs are found through intermediaries versus versus directly the firm posting. And again, so my not perfect recollection for this is that there were, especially early on in the sample, there's quite a lot of jobs for secretarial, office administrative work that is through placement agencies. So the fact that we're requiring to identify the posting firm, likely that's leading us to skew even further towards higher skilled work. So that's another thing that we could potentially correct for, but we're not in today's presentation. By using information about the occupation code of different ads, that's something that we've extracted. Did that answer your question, or did you?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay,
I think it would be fascinating as a further research to actually look into the specifically in the employment intermediaries, because there is I'll send you some links about it, but I think it can be a thing on its own.
That's fantastic. Yes, I would appreciate that. That's very exciting. Okay, great. All right, so to give you a little bit of intuition about our data sets. So here we have a list of commonly appearing job titles that emerged in each decade in our sample, from the 50s to the 2000s. So the reason that the 1940s is missing is exactly this issue of censoring or truncation. So we can't include a panel for the 1940s since all of the job titles first appeared in our data set in this period. But despite that, so we see that in the 1970s was a decade in which a lot of word processing types of jobs first appeared. Some jobs related to the World Wide Web were first mentioned in the 1990s. And then here's kind of the flip side of that. So for each of the first 5 decades within our sample, we can see what were the commonly appearing job titles that last appeared in that decade. So long distance telephone operator, that was a job title that was pretty common in the 1940s and 1950s. It disappeared in the 1950s. And then things like related to stenography last appeared in the 1970s. And okay, so to point out maybe some of the curiosities or limitations of this approach, there are jobs like office boy, which first of all, I'm not exactly sure what kind of work that corresponds to, but I imagine that there are more, even past the 1970s, people who do a lot of this similar work, but just with a different label. So in many instances, we're capturing the true disappearance of work practices, but in other cases, it may be the case that just there's different naming conventions to existing work that are accountable for the differences that we document. But with that in mind, I'll try and convince you that these job title vintage measures, that they do have economic content, that they are indicative of innovative activity and not simply only a relabeling of existing work. Okay, so that's the second component of this presentation. So what I'll do is I'll present regressions where we compare advertisements with new versus old job titles. So we'll have two of our three measures of job title vintages as our explanatory variables. So this, we have a regression in which we have for an ad A that was posted in year T, what was the year of emergence for that job title, so the first percentile based measure, or the year in which that job title appeared. And so we'll compare these job title vintage measures to other characteristics of the job. So this could be things like the posted salary for the subset of ads for which we see the salary, mentions of an information or communication technology, and here are a few examples of those, or mentions of a degree requirement within the ad. So in all of the regressions on the next slide, will include year fixed effects and occupation fixed effects, meaning that our comparisons are among ads that are posted within a given year, within a given SOC occupation. So we'll be comparing job title vintages versus these other characteristics, holding those things fixed. Okay, so here are the results from this set of regressions. So we have different dependent variables and our two job title vintage measures, and we have the relationship between the job title vintage measures and salary, degree requirements, or technology mentions. So as the first title indicates, or as the first column indicates, ads with newer job title vintages have higher posted salaries. So to give you some kind of economic meaning in this regression, so a decade increase in an ad's job vintage is associated with roughly a 2 percentage point increase in posted salaries. So the idea here is that posted salaries are one proxy for the skills required within the job, and so that the ability to work within new fields corresponds to higher level of skills and thus involves better pay. And I'm sure there are other factors that might lead to some correlation between job title vintages and salary, but this is our interpretation of this association. Consistent with this first column and our interpretation of it, we find that ads with newer vintage job titles mention an undergraduate degree as a requirement more frequently. The evidence for graduate degrees is a little bit more muddled. And then finally, the last column suggests that newer vintage job titles, ads with newer vintage job titles also mention emerging information and communication technologies more frequently. All right. So newer vintage job titles represent work by highly skilled individuals involving new technologies. These are hallmark. Oh, please, yes.
Wait, sorry, maybe I missed it, but
No,
will
please.
you tell us what you how you measure technology?
Oh, great. Yes. So sorry. So in each ad, yeah, sorry for skipping over this. We look for just mentions of um, EDP. So this is a data exchange program, Unix, Lotus 1, 2, 3, 4, Fortran, and then we had a list that we collected of technologies that appeared um, within these ads. So there were a total of 48, and we just kind of looked for hard matches of any of the mentions of those technologies. So it's not much more than that.
Thanks.
Oh yeah, great. Thanks
Wonder,
for. Yeah, please.
Yeah, can I ask another question?
Please, yes, of course.
I think I'm thinking about David Otter's Ely lecture and the multiple categories of new work that he describes. The first one being frontier jobs, which seems to be what you're trying to get at, but the other two being wealth work and last mile jobs. Now, that was his work, and I'm sure that there are even more categories, or potentially even more categories. Is there a way we can differentiate between these three categories in your work, and or create some sort of decomposition between these types of jobs over time?
I think that's a great idea. So the way that one could go about that, and I think the way that would be easiest to go about that, would be we've collected, or we've tried to assign an occupation code for each job title. And so what I would imagine is that the last mile work would fall within certain service or maybe a restaurant type work, or things that or personal care services. So there are occupation codes that correspond to that. The frontier, you could imagine, would be something that if the occupation code is linked to finance, to math and computers, to physical and social sciences, or to engineering. So I think the if we were to do that, the would be based on that. And then it's something that we have played around with a little bit, not using the frontier, last mile. What was the third, Sarah?
I think it was frontier, last mile, and wealth work.
And wealth work, yes. So not using this dichotomy, but we have thought of kind of like organizational. So things related to management, to finance, sales, and office administrative work versus technological, so related to computers, math, maybe physical sciences, engineering. And we have that we have those kind of, so the correlations that I'll show you in this section, we have those separated out by that particular categorization. And I think, yeah, there's definitely much more that we can do in that direction. And I think that is very, very interesting. And yeah, did you have a follow up?
No. I just think that, like, you're speaking about job title vintage as an indicator of innovative high skill activity. Some of those, like, I think some wealth work can be perceived as innovative.
Yeah.
But certainly last mile work we would perceive as not innovative. But I think just trying to differentiate between those would be, it's more just a thought than an actual action item.
No, that's great. I think what would be reassuring is if, at least in this final column, and maybe in these other columns, I'm not sure, the last mile and wealth, okay, depending on your view of these, maybe wouldn't be as as correlated as when compared to the frontier work. But I think that's a very useful exercise that we can try out.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so far, what have we done? Newer vintage job titles.
Another question.
Oh, please.
I mean, the statement we want to say is that for some reason, the introduction of new titles is biased towards the higher skilled.
Mm-hmm.
That may be, I mean, I presume that putting ads in the New York Times and the Boston Globe, et cetera, has a cost, and that cost is relatively fixed. It's not that significant if you're hiring somebody who's very expensive, but it may be more significant if you're hiring somebody who's less expensive. And so I don't know. So could it be that it's really an artifact of the sampling more than of technology? Or and if it was technology, is there time variation over this feature over time? Because we think that skill bias technical change was, particularly accelerated in one part of your sample and not throughout the sample. So sort of two questions: it might be a consequence of sampling bias, and is there heterogeneity? I mean, the previous question was, last mile and so on, is there heterogeneity in the effects, right?
Sure.
One question is, is this changing over time? Is that a source of heterogeneity?
Is the extent to which high versus less skilled jobs appear in our data set, is that changing over time? That's the question.
You're assuming that you're concluding, your claim is that new titles imply higher skilled activities. Is that your claim?
Yes.
Right.
Sure.
So, but if you're only getting, if the only people who announce are so the low skill activities, people don't hire by posting in the New York Times, or
That's true, but okay. So these other variables, they're also coming from within our data set. So I am not sure that will necessarily. I mean, it could definitely bias us, but I'm not sure in which direction it necessarily would. That, yeah. But so I guess I don't have a great answer to your question.
Okay.
The one thing that I'll say, so one thing that you asked is the representativeness of our sample, is that changing over time? And so we did in our past work try and look at that a little bit and comparing. So the current population survey, they ask a survey question: if you're looking for a job, to what extent is that through newspapers versus through other channels? And while it is true that higher skilled work tends to be found more through newspapers than through other sources, like going directly to the job site or through one's social networks, that there aren't any trends in the kind of proportion to it, or the extra proportion to which jobs are found in newspapers for high skilled work. So we have looked at it a little bit, but to your narrow question, I would have to think about it a little bit more. Okay, let me proceed. I think these are all terrific questions, but I do want to be a little mindful of the time. Okay, so what have we done so far? Newer vintage job titles represent work by highly skilled individuals, or at least that's what I've claimed here, that involve new technologies. What about the firms specifically that mention these new work practices? So the first step is to define firm year measures of our job title vintage measures, which previously we had at the ads level. So we're going to do something very simple, which is for each firm I, for each year T, we're going to look at the set of ads, and we'll call that A, the ads that firm I posts in year T, and we'll just compute the raw mean average of this variable that was at the ad level for the firm. So if the firm posts 10 ads, some that have a very high year of emergence, some that have low, some we'll have something that's in the middle. But we'll have kind of variation at the firm year level based off of the collection of ads that the firm posts in that year. Okay, so what are our regressions going to look like? So we're going to regress firm performance measures against these firm year level job title vintage measures. So the coefficients of interest are beta 1, beta 2, and beta 3, and those will give the associations between the firm's propensity to post for newer work versus other firm level characteristics. So here, X could be the productivity of the firm, sales or productivity growth in the future, or conventional measures of innovative activity. So we're always, in all of our specifications, going to include year fixed effects and industry fixed effects. In addition, in some specifications, we're going to control for the occupational mix that the firm advertises for. So briefly, this SITO is the share of firm I's ads in year T that are in broad occupation, so maybe 2-digit occupation O. So we're controlling for the portfolio of 2-digit occupations that the firm posts for. And when possible, so when we're looking at outcomes for publicly traded firms, we may include as well measures for the capital stock, the labor employed, or the sales of the firm. Okay, so our first set of regressions look at the relationships between our vintage measures and labor productivity. So we first see that there's no significant association between posting for newer work practices on the one hand and contemporaneous labor productivity on the other. So just to remind you, this is the log revenues over employees of the firm. This is something that can only be measured for publicly traded firms. So that's our measure of labor productivity. And so we see that there's no significant relationship in either direction between labor productivity and these different job vintage measures, whether we include or don't include these controls for the broad occupational mix that the firm posts for. On the other hand, there is a rather strong relationship between posting for newer work, posting ads with newer vintage job titles, and having high R&D expenditures to sales ratios. So to give you a little bit of an idea of the magnitudes involved, a decade difference in our job title vintage measure is roughly associated with a 30 log point increase or difference in R&D intensity.
So can I ask one quick question?
Of course, yeah.
What is the ratio of the ads per worker in these firms, more or less?
I haven't computed that. Do you have an idea of how that information could be useful, or?
Well, it would give us a sense of which share of the workforce you might be sampling for these firms. Also to have a sense of how noisy your your variables are when it comes to occupation mix. So if it's 10%, that's of course a very large percentage of the jobs. But if it's like 1 in 1,000, then you know that you're basically looking at the tip of the iceberg. So the question is, how big for these firms? How relevant are these ads as a description of their labor force?
Sure, I think you should think of this more, unfortunately, as kind of a tip of the iceberg thing. So we have in our data set a few 100,000 ads for which we can identify the firm name over a sample of 50 plus years or 60 years. So there are, within that period, there are hundreds of millions of vacancies that are being filled. So there is, because of, consistent with that, there's going to be quite a lot of noise from year to year in our firm year level measures of posting for new work. If anything, that should, if this problem, it sounds like a classical measurement error, which should make it a little bit more difficult for us to find any significant relationships here.
Yes, and it's also that I think the way to interpret these vintages is that they are probably vintages of the tail of the productivity jobs, right? So if they, as Ricardo said, that you're going to try to hire the most important people you're going to have job ads for, then what you're really expressing here is like the vintage of like the upper 1% of the people that you're trying to hire. But maybe that's the wrong interpretation.
So I think there is definitely some truth to that. The one thing that I would say that might go in the opposite direction, and so this isn't really a solution to a problem, but yet another problem, which is that, for each managerial job, you might post one ad, but if you're hiring, let's say, a fast food chain that is not like a non-franchised fast food chain, and you need to hire 100 people to work in different locations at the checkout counter, you might need to only post one ad. So that would kind of, I think, put things in the, oh no, I guess that would be in the same direction as well.
But I think that
right.
would probably help you, because most of these technologies might not be the entire labor force that is affected by this technology adoption. At least not the high-end technology that you might be picking up.
Right. Okay, I think this is great. So I think kind of a common theme of some of these comments is that we should be more mindful of the difference between the mix of types of work or broad kind of occupational categories in our data set versus the labor force at large, which I think in some respects we can do better on, and in some respects we'll just have an imperfect sample.
Well, I think it's not that big of a deal, because a lot of people have been using LinkedIn data, which obviously has the same kind of biases, but in a different way. And I think most of those papers, they have some kind of rough check of whether the occupations are somewhat representative of the industries that you're looking at. But this is also, for now, I think, accepted practice.
Great. That's very helpful. Okay, so on this slide, at least here, no contemporaneous relationship between labor productivity and posting for new work, but there is with R&D intensity. Furthermore, we can look at the firm's performance over the next 5 or 10 years. So here we have a regression in which we're looking just at the sample of firms that are publicly traded in year T and also in year T+5. So there's some survivorship bias to think about, which we've tried to address in different ways. But for here, we're looking at the sample of firms that are publicly traded in year T and year T+5 and say, what's their revenue growth in that 5-year period or in that 10-year period? And so we can look at that growth rate, compare it to our new firm year measure of posting for new work practices, and potentially also control for the firm's patenting activity and R&D intensity. And the takeaway here is that a posting for newer vintage work, so a decade increase in new vintage work, is associated with roughly 10 log point higher sales growth in the five years after the ads are posted, or a 16 log point increase in growth over the next 10 years. Okay, and then finally, we ask whether firms who post for newer vintage job titles, they themselves are younger, or they're more likely to exit in the near future. So we have our final set of kind of descriptive regressions here. We're regressing the year in which the firm entered into existence. So we had to kind of try and hand collect as best as we could when the firm itself was born, or when it left the universe of firms. So either when it went out of business or when it was acquired by some other firm. And so we see here that there is a pretty sizable relationship between posting for newer vintage work and being young, being a young firm. The relationship between posting for newer vintage work and actually exiting the sample of firms is a little bit less clear cut. We've looked at this relationship between posting for newer vintage job titles, entry and exit, also in a second way, looking at when did the firm, instead of being founded, when did it enter or exit from the sample of publicly traded firms. There, the associations are slightly weaker for the relationship between age and posting for newer vintage work, but slightly stronger for surviving into the sample and posting for newer vintage work. Okay, so let me summarize what we've done so far, and let me tell you a little bit about some other exercises that we have looked at. So new posting ads for new work is correlated with other activities like having high R&D to sales ratios. It's predictive of survival and future growth. Here, survival is, survival in terms of remaining a publicly traded firm, and it tends to occur in young firms. And actually, so the evidence on whether older or younger firms tend to patent more or have high R&D intensity, I maybe I'm overstating this a little. It's a little bit more mixed in the literature, or that's my reading. There are other exercises that we have looked at. So among all firms, new work is associated with being publicly traded, with patenting more frequently, with having more patent citations. And then among the sample of privately held firms, firms that post for newer work practices are more likely to go public in the future. How am I doing on time?
You have 8 more minutes.
Okay,
but
perfect.
we can continue since we had so
okay.
many questions. So
great. This is terrific. So let me briefly describe. So since I only have 8 minutes, I don't have time to go through the the model fully, but let me briefly describe the model that we use to understand to what extent does job title vintage updating, does it occur via firm entry and exit versus incumbents who over time update or post ads for newer work practices. So the goal of this model is to investigate these two sources of churn, of updating of job title vintages. Okay, so I won't really present any equations or anything like that. This will be mostly verbal. So in this slide, I'll describe a little bit the general, in very general terms, the environment of our model, the setup, and then in the next slide, I'll give you some intuition about how we estimate that model and what the main results are. There's a lot of detail that's being not discussed, unfortunately. Okay, so the model is of a heterogeneous firm industry where firms are going to differ along 3 dimensions. So first, the year in which, or the period in which the firm appeared. We'll generically, or we'll use T to refer to different points in time. So firms are at different points in time, they're going to enter the industry, and one variable will be the difference between the current period and the period in which the firm appeared. A second distinguishing factor will be what we'll call we'll have just one variable, which we'll call V, that will characterize the vintage of the technology that the firm utilizes. And then finally, a marginal cost shifter, or a productivity term, Z. So the kind of key new element of our model is that firms are going to enter, they're going to enter with a particular job title vintage. And if they want to remain in the industry, they're going to have to periodically update that vintage. And the way that that's going to play out in our model is we're going to have a new assumption that firms that have a job title vintage fee that is less than or equal to the current period T will say that they have an obsolete technology and by assumption are forced to exit the industry. Okay, so there are kind of 2 sets of firms in our model. There are entrants or potential entrants who decide, should I enter? And they're going to enter after paying some sunk cost to draw a vintage that's between T and T plus 1, so between the obsolete vintage and some, maybe we can call this the frontier vintage. So as time goes on, these numbers are going to be kind of increasing. And then they'll also draw this marginal cost shifter, this productivity term Z. This C will be fixed throughout the firm's life, but maybe in our model, the V will be something that firms can update at some cost. So how do they do that? So the incumbents, they'll earn some variable profits that are increasing in this Z term, and they'll decide to forego some current period profits to update their technology vintage. And so the more they pay, the more likely it is that they'll be able to update to the frontier technology vintage at that point in time. Okay, so these are the players, and the main decisions in this model are of the potential entrants. Should I decide to enter the industry? Or the incumbents, how much should I decide to pay to update my vintage? And so the main trade-offs are a free entry condition whereby the sunk cost of entering the industry is going to be equated to the expected value of profits of the firm over its life if it decides to enter. And for the incumbents, the marginal benefit and marginal cost of paying more to update the technology vintage are going to be equated. So there's some marginal cost of updating the technology vintage, and that will equal the expected benefit of moving from whatever vintage technology the firm is working with to the frontier. So there are three main parameters in this model. So first is the size of the sunk entry cost relative to the cost associated with technology updating. Second, the dispersion in the Z terms, these productivity terms for entrants. And then third, the number of years that a model period represents. So we're going to estimate these parameters jointly with some set of moments via a simulated method of moments procedure. Let me just tell you a little bit about the intuition about how one of these parameters, maybe the most kind of economically important parameter, is identified. Just rough intuition. All of these are identified jointly, but some moments are a little bit more useful than others. So how can we, based off of the model, figure out how large the marginal cost of incumbent upgrading is to the sunk entry cost? And one useful moment in the data is the correlation between the firm's actual calendar age and its job title vintage. What does that correlation look like in the data? And so how is this moment useful for estimating this parameter? Well, think about what would the equilibrium look like if the marginal cost of incumbents updating their technology was really high, or the sunk entry cost of entering was really low. Well, then the marginal benefit relative to the marginal cost of updating the technology is going to be pretty low. So the incumbents, their decisions in the model, they're going to update their vintage relatively infrequently. And so what's going to happen is that firms are going to enter at some point in time. They're not going to update their technology vintage that frequently, and so they'll enter somewhere near the frontier and leave with an obsolete technology. This will result in a relatively high or strong relationship between when the firm entered the industry and its distance to the technology frontier. And so that's what links this particular correlation to this particular moment in our data. And so anyway, so we have a number of moments that we can measure using our job ed data, and some correlations and dispersions among these three variables. Our main result is that both incumbents and the net entry margin are roughly equally important for industry or aggregate technology upgrading. So that's all I wanted to say today. So this slide just summarizes what we've discussed up until now. So thank you so much for your very excellent questions and suggestions. I'd be very happy to stick around more if you have additional questions, if that's feasible. But thank you so much for attending.
Thank you, Enghin. This was terrific.